Okay, welcome back to the DocFest Exchange. This series of talks is programmed in collaboration with the Wellcome Trust. They're a global charity who love to get behind inspiring stories and innovative approaches to filmmaking. They have a broadcast and interactive team, and that's enough about the Wellcome Trust. I think let's get on with our talk. So today we're going to be talking about Unlocking the Cage, which it has screened once at Sheffield already, and I think it screens again on tonight. Yeah. It's my pleasure to introduce Bob McKay, who teaches literature and film at the University of Sheffield, and specifically an interesting niche, I think, of human and animal relations in film. And then we have Camila Ruz, BBC journalist with a specialism in zoology, and she tells me that her family owns a zoo in Chile. So these are the perfect people to be talking about this film, Unlocking the Cage. We have a trailer that we can show if you haven't seen the film, and the idea is that we have a conversation around themes inspired by the film. Very short, it's a short conversation. There's an opportunity for questions, so do think about questions as we go along. I'm going to hand over to Camilla.
Thank you very much. So I think if we can watch the clip, that would be a good way of getting started. Well, it is a truly amazing film, and if you haven't seen it, I would definitely encourage you to watch it later today. So I think we'll start off with one of the biggest themes in my mind in this is the blurring of the line between humans and animals, which happens from the very beginning of this film. We see scenes of gorillas showing empathy towards characters in a TV show. We see chimpanzees using sign language. But is there a danger of anthropomorphizing animals in films like this?
Well, I guess for me the key question with that when you're thinking about anthropomorphism is to focus on what the film's trying to achieve and think about the form in which anthropomorphism might appear. So the sort of history of worries about that, the notion of blurring the boundary between humans and animals, or projecting ideas about humanity onto animals when trying to understand them and therefore not understanding them in their difference, really emerges out of experimental science and the worry that you would get wrong answers by doing that. For me, if you took anthropomorphism away from film, you would have no film. Anthropomorphism emerges in filmic representations of animals from early silent cinema onwards, and has been a really driving force in film storytelling. With this film specifically, you're sort of caught. The film is sort of caught in a double bind with respect to that, because Stephen Wise, the case that he's making is that particular kinds of animals, great apes, elephants, cetaceans, have enough similar capacities to humans with respect to particular things, cognitive abilities, that they can be recognized as persons by the law. And the law will only recognize them as persons if you present the case that they're like humans. Mm-hmm. So he's got to do this. He's got to present them anthropomorphically, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. And there is a danger that you could be looking at animals as victims.
Yeah, sure.
Because if you consider them, if you only focus on the similarities and you never look at the otherness of animals, mm-hmm. which in fact is part of what makes them incredible. Yeah. Is there a risk that you are kind of limiting what they can do?
It's true. I mean, I think that it would be wonderful to imagine forms of filmmaking that are able to capture the actuality of animals' sheer and utter strangeness and amazing otherness from humanity. And I think there are some films, even documentary films, that work in that mode. So the French film Microcosmos, for example, uses various kinds of filmic techniques to try and capture the strange otherworldliness of insect experience. It's very, very difficult to do, I think, and it's very difficult for documentary to do, because in particular certain kinds of documentary, and this one, which is trying to focus on a particular story, is necessarily drawn back towards the kind of story that the world is telling about those chimpanzees. So at this point, the true strangeness and otherness of the chimpanzees in this film is that a chimpanzee might in 1989 perform in a film with Matthew Broderick, and then in 2011 be living in a cage behind a gas station in rural America, and trying to imagine what that might be like for a chimpanzee is still an amazing task, I think.
Yeah.
This film doesn't try and do that kind of durational filmmaking that throws us into what it might be like to be the chimpanzee in that cage. Mm-hmm. Again, there are other documentary filmmakers. There's a filmmaker, Nick Philibert, who makes films of that sort, where literally nothing happens except you're in the experience of that orangutan in this case. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to do. It doesn't make the kind of filmmaking that lots of people want to go and pay money to see. It would be more authentic in some ways, but
because I think we're not actually very good as a species at, well, in fact, it's very difficult to imagine what it must be like to be a different species, to be a completely different type of animal. And we see it not just in film, but also in scientific research. So I'm reading a book which is fascinating, and it goes through some of the animal behavioural studies and kind of picks them apart. So there is an amazing case, I think it's chimpanzees, who were thought for years not to be able to recognise individuals, so they weren't able to recognise faces. And then one of the researchers sort of stopped and went, wait a second, we're using photos of human faces. And they showed the chimps photos of other chimpanzees, and straight away they were fine. They could recognise individuals without a problem. And we've done similar things with elephants, where we've tried to get them to recognise themselves in mirrors. And, the elephants couldn't do it until we used a mirror that was big enough for the elephant to actually see more than its legs. And suddenly, miraculously, the elephants were great at it. So, it is, as you were saying, difficult to show, look for us to look outside ourselves.
I agree. And in a way, I think that there's a great moment in Unlocking the Cage where, so Stephen Wise, this central figure in the film who's being followed by Pennebaker and Hegedus, the film mainly focuses on either the sort of story of how he's gathering information in order to put this case together, or in the actual courtroom settings where he's presenting the case. But there's a wonderful moment where he has compiled his brief for the judge, and he has to take it to the court, and it's a giant suitcase, and he says, there's something like 90 pounds of just affidavits from scientists about the kinds of things that chimpanzees and other great apes can do. And the film just quietly captures that if people ask the right kinds of questions, you can generate the right kind of information, or other richer kinds of information about animal life. It's very much, I think this comes back to what you were saying, we're not very good as a species at looking outside our own way of thinking. I mean, I think that human beings are very dogmatic kinds of creatures. We're very good at having established patterns of wisdom that we like to rehearse and call that knowledge. And I think that you see that again and again in the film too. Yeah. Particularly judges, and this is one of the key tensions in the film, is the film is very interested in the development of law, of common law, and how it emerges in an ongoing series of judges' decisions. And you see over and over again the judges caught between reiterating and reconfirming decisions taken by judges previously, and possibly breaking a threshold or opening onto a new kind of way of thinking about animal life. And that becomes one of the cruxes of the film, is will a judge take the next step in the development of the common law to recognise a great ape as a person?
Sure. And it's very interesting in the film because you see the focus in a way is actually on the humans involved, on the people within it, rather than on the animals. Okay. So you kind of get a whole spectrum of reactions. So you've got the judge who is kind of interested but doesn't really want to take the risk. Then you have the judge that isn't interested and doesn't want to even consider the option that apes could be, as cognitively intelligent or in many other ways as humans and should have some rights. So would you say that, this film is actually kind of more about people in a way than about animals?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, the film, in the trailer there, it suggested that it was a legal taut courtroom thriller, I think it described it as. I mean, I think thriller is possibly pushing it as a generic term. It's definitely a courtroom drama. It has a lot of the generic features of courtroom dramas. It's built around a very powerful narrative event. What decision will be taken about this case? And that narrative event is framed with the backstory of the people involved. And this you see this again and again in filmmaking that's just like this one is. You might approach thinking that it's filmmaking about animals, but it's very, very difficult to make films about animals because animals, real ones, don't talk. They don't really do anything that is recognisable to film as narrative. So you might get, you can make narratives out of their lives, which are often to do with capture, hunting. Will this animal catch that thing? Will this animal stay alive in this fight? Those kinds of core narratives. But the main things that lots of animals do, eat, sleep, quite slow in narrative terms. So films tend to focus on humans' relationships with animals, and then try and think about the animals in those terms. And this film certainly does that, much like other campaigning documentaries about animal life, like Blackfish or Project Nim, two of the sort of most well-known recent ones, do work in very similar ways.
And is it kind of unusual to see a legal drama or a legal thriller that focuses on the relationship between humans and animals? So, I mean, the documentary in a way is trying to make sense of that relationship. And do other genres, other kinds of films do it in different ways?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very rare to see. I'm just trying to think. Pretty much, if there's a film with an animal in it and it's possible for me to have seen it, I've seen it. I'm just trying to think. To be honest, it's Legally Blonde 2 is the only one I can think of that's another legal drama that's animal focused. There may be others, but certainly what I've found in my research on animals in film is how important the genre of filmmaking is in determining the kind of story that can be told about animals. So this is, in a way, something that's it's a challenge when you watch a film like this. That on the one hand, the story that is being told, the content of the film, wants to make a very particular and determined and factual case about animal life. Great apes can do this, they can think that, they have these kinds of experiences. And the film doesn't want to say to you, because I'm a documentary, I can tell you certain kinds of things about animal life, but not others. And when I look across film, horror movies will present animals to you in different kinds of ways and make you think different kinds of things about them.
Can we have an example?
So, well, I mean, if you think about The Birds, for example, that's a film that absolutely focuses on the utter otherworldly strangeness of birds, and it zeroes in on that and then heightens it as a very powerful effect of the film. The Birds begins with domesticated animals, birds in a cage in a pet shop, and it sort of explodes outwards into these swarming birds that can't be controlled. And it's that tension between domesticity and chaotic wildness that's part of the horror of the film. I suppose my reading of that would be to say neither of these things are true ways of understanding what an animal is. They're ways of thinking about animals that different genres promote you to imagine. Sure. Similarly, family films, so everything from Born Free on the one hand to Beethoven in the 1990s, they tend to present mainly domestic animals, and what they'll tend to do is suggest that animals are, first of all, chaotic. They bring chaos into a home, but that chaos can be reaccommodated eventually. Just it's the same. It helps the narrative story of the child usually in that film who's fighting against their parents, but will eventually learn to grow up and be a sort of functioning adult in the world. And the pet story helps the film tell that human story.
Sure. So in a way, it's those kind of films are still making animals ordered and neat and tidy and back into kind of our human understanding. Sure.
I mean, I think that I think film is always going to do this, and in fact, even the most avant-garde or strangest of films still uses and draws on various kinds of stylistic techniques to throw you into certain aspects of animal life. This is just a kind of inevitable aspect of filmmaking that I suppose that I'm arguing that film is never going to capture reality like that. What it's going to do is frame it for you and shape it for you in particular ways and ask you to respond to it in a certain way. Just in the same way that Wise, as an advocate for animals in the court, is trying to say, don't think about cows, don't think about fish, just think about these three kinds of species and only think about these things about them, their cognitive capacity, the fact that they can imagine a future, because those specific things might help the judge make a particular decision about animal life in that moment.
Sure. So it is interesting that this film in particular focuses on great apes, on chimpanzees. But Stephen Wise is planning to take the case to elephants, and he's going to argue that I think it's 2 or 3 elephants in circuses in the US should also have rights. If this was a film about, I don't know, the very intelligent grey African parrot, for example, would it have the same power? You know, do we find it so easy when it's an animal that doesn't look like us?
It's a really good question, to which, I mean, I don't know, I'd be interested to know what the audience think. For me, I cede the power to the filmmaker with that one. I think that there is a tendency in responding to these films to think that what the species is determines how you respond to it. I'm not convinced about that. I think that the way that a film is made, the craft of making it and the quality of the film has the power to provoke audience responses of multiform kinds. So I think that the right kind of film, a good kind of film about an African grey parrot, will make you respond in certain kinds of ways. But it's true that the challenge and with a film like this is that the narrative decision, will the great apes get granted personhood by the judge, is a decision that will be taken on the grounds of similarity, not difference. It's not taken on the grounds that animals are so wonderful and strange that you should leave them alone and not put them in cages. The decision will be taken on the idea that animals are so like humans, and because you don't put humans in cages, you shouldn't put animals in cages. That's how the decision works. So the emotional power of that story is more likely to work with great apes because it's easier to present them as like humans. Does that make sense?
It does make perfect sense. So I think we'd love to get some questions now, or some comments or thoughts from anyone who's seen the film or who just wants to have a chat. Would be great. Please.
Hi, I haven't seen the film, but isn't the end game of this the end of zoos? And zoos now are there to enables animals to thrive and to support them, and what we're doing to the planet now will end up undermining the situation for a lot of animals. And without zoos, obviously zoos are not like they were 30, 40 years ago. They're more scientifically based as well as entertainment based. And I think if you have the end of zoos, it's my own personal opinion, then you'll create greater problems for animals.
It's a really good question, I think. Do you want to come in? Or?
Yeah, I think I will, because I'm hugely biased because my family have a big zoo in Chile. And I do still think that zoos have a place in the modern world. But, and I don't want to say anything that's going to get me disowned by my family, but I think there are some species of animals who are not happy in captivity. And you can see that from their behavior. You know, they do this. You might have seen it in zoos where they have these repetitive patterns where they walk backwards and forwards on their cages, and it's a sign of stress. And, elephants should live in herds, for example, where you have 20 or 30 animals. So to suddenly be in a small enclosure with just 1 or 2 is a very big problem for them. So I think we should take into account the differences between species, and I think modern zoos do need to think of that, and not just assume that, because people need to learn about animals, that we should have all of them within cages.
I agree with that. I think that it's an interesting one. For me, one of the problems that I would have with Wise's whole project is that you could argue that the end game of his project is not the end of zoos, but the end of zoos that have got those animals that you can prove are like humans enough to be human persons, that they won't be in zoos, and you could have any number of zoos that had different kinds of animals in them, as long as they didn't have those. So the argument reaffirms human centrality in lots of ways. So there's a risk there. I think the other thing I would say is that, I agree that the problem of like anthropogenic climate change and the impact on animal lives of habitat encroachment and all of these sorts of things is desperate. I think that what I would say is that there's a midway point. It's not an either-or question in terms of the end of zoos or not. So just in the same way that you might read, for example, a Charles Dickens novel from the 19th century about horrendous schooling for children, where children are punished with sticks if they don't give the right answer to a specific question and they're able to answer by rote. People at that point, in response to Dickens's critiques, would say, well, this is the end of education. If you're not going to force children to do their times table by rote, how are they going to learn anything? The end game of this could be a very, very different understanding of what a zoo is. That you could have a zoo, but you couldn't have a zoo in the centre of a city. You couldn't have a zoo, that had enclosures of any kind of limited size. That you could have some zoos, but you would just, if animals are that precious to keep, they would need to be much bigger. You would need to spend much more resources on them. Governments would need to be looking at kind of welfare programs for animals that are used in film, and how are you going to look after them afterwards? So this, all I'm saying is it's not an either or. I think that it does raise very difficult questions for zoos, the film, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there is a mentality with some zoos that I think is or should be challenged. And, for example, there are some zoos that won't take a tiger if it doesn't have a perfectly long tail because it's not pretty enough. Mm-hmm. For example, that is the kind of mentality I think that Stephen Wise would argue is wrong. And I think that that's fair enough. Any other questions?
Hi there. I haven't actually seen the film yet, so forgive me for being a little bit redundant here. You mentioned the Matthew Broderick 19. I'm assuming you mean the Project X film and the Virgil chimp.
Yeah.
What was the outcome of that? You mentioned that the same chimp was living in a cage behind it.
So there's a... I don't want to give away too much from the film, but so that chimp becomes... So that Wise has to put together 3 great ape plaintiffs in order to make a case to the court that great apes should be subject to writs of habeas corpus, so that you can basically get a judge to decide whether it's okay to detain you, and that chimps should be open for that legal decision, or should be subject to that legal decision. And one of the chimps that they discover is in a roadside behind a roadside garage in rural New York, and you go in, and so it's basically 3 small cages with drawings, effectively paintings of trees, and a TV, a small 1980s box TV. And it turns out that that's the chimp from that film, from Project X. It's Project X, it's called, isn't it?
Project X, yeah.
And for me, what it did was it threw me into a very particular question about the ethical responsibilities of not just filmmakers, but people who watch films and enjoy them. That Project X probably circulates now on the internet or via Netflix. So it's very difficult for film to have a memory of the individual animals who worked in that film. So that chimpanzee has spent, it's just ended up 20 years in that cage, in part because of a desire to engage with chimpanzees in particular kinds of ways via film. It's really, really troubling, and I think it's one of the things that Pennebaker and Hedges are doing with this film, is trying to make film making take responsibility for those kinds of relationships, human-animal relationships on which it's drawn. And film, it's an ironic one. Throughout the history of film, films about animals repeatedly have a sort of soft message for the viewer, which is that you should be nice to animals. It's bad to be horrible to them. They should be free. They should, that kind of thing. It has, just in the same way that film sort of tends to teach you to be a nice person, wants to get you to be nice. But very often the processes involved in making films are just nothing like the kinds of things that the film is actually advocating, if you see what I mean.
So they're looking to change the ethics of filmmaking as well as...
very quietly. So there's a number of interpolations into the film as part of its technique. So you get little clips of, hideous Fox News style TV reports about the case, and some grainy activist footage from inside circuses and stuff. And then a couple of other interpolations are actually from Hollywood movies that have the chimpanzees in them that are the plaintiffs. And it very quietly does it, but in the opposition between the Hollywood form and the verite-style documentary form, it's sort of saying, what is film's responsibility here to these animals, I think?
It does that for other animals. Well, with the space program chimpanzees, remember that?
Yeah, sure. There's a few. There's just so there are little clips, aren't there, of Ham, the first not the first chimp that went into space, but the very famous chimp that went into space. And so it does recognise that often animals have this kind of totemic force in stories that human beings like to tell themselves about. We're heading into the future, we're going to have this grand scientific future where we can go into space, but in order to make it happen, it started off with fruit flies, and then it's mice, and then it's chimpanzees go into space. So the film has quiet reminders of those. It's not the centre of the film, really, but it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So do we have time for one more question? Yes? Is there one more?
If we have one more.
No? Well, we've finished perfectly on time then. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone,
Pleasure
for coming.
talking to everybody. Thank you.